A wealthy woman calls 911 on Big Shaq, demanding he leave his own driveway. The cops arrive, aggressive, ready to act. But when the truth comes out, what happens next shocks everyone and leaves the entire neighborhood changed forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The Miami sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the pristine streets of West Haven Estates, a gated community where the sidewalks were spotless, the lawns were professionally maintained, and silence was broken only by the occasional hum of a luxury car engine. Big Shaq was no stranger to wealth, but he had always believed in keeping life simple. Despite his multi-million-dollar fortune, his mansion wasn't an over-the-top display of extravagance. It was a home, a place where he could unwind, disconnect, and be himself. No cameras, no flashing lights, no crowds. Just peace. Today felt like just another normal afternoon. As his black Rolls-Royce Cullinan glided through the automated gates of his estate, he barely noticed the heads turning, the curtains shifting as a few nosy neighbors peeked from their windows. He was used to that. People still got surprised seeing a 7-foot 1-inch basketball legend casually pulling into the driveway next door. Dressed in a black hoodie, designer sweatpants, and slides, Shaq parked in front of his massive stone-finished mansion. He reached for his gym bag in the passenger seat and stepped out, stretching his towering frame as he took in the familiar sight of palm trees swaying in the warm breeze. Then came the sound. Sharp, fast, deliberate footsteps. Shaq barely had time to process before a woman's voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." He turned, raising a brow as he spotted a middle-aged woman storming toward him from across the street. Heels clicking against the pavement, designer purse swinging at her side, sunglasses perched high on her nose like a queen surveying her kingdom. Shaq exhaled slowly. He already knew where this was going. Colleen Davenport was exactly the kind of woman West Haven Estates was built for, or so she thought. Wealthy, well-connected, and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards. She thrived on knowing every face, every car, every move made within the gates. So when she spotted a massive, unfamiliar man stepping out of an SUV worth more than most houses, alarm bells rang in her head. She had never seen him before, and in her mind, that was a problem. Without hesitation, she marched over, her expression a mix of suspicion and determination. "Who are you?" she demanded the moment she was within earshot. "And what are you doing here?" Shaq, still holding his gym bag, blinked at her. "Excuse me?" Colleen placed a perfectly manicured hand on her hip. "I asked, who are you? I don't recognize you, and this is a private neighborhood." Shaq tilted his head slightly, amused but also tired. He had lived in this neighborhood for 6 years, hosted charity events, given away turkeys on Thanksgiving, played basketball with kids on the cul-de-sac. Yet here he was, being interrogated on his own property. He adjusted his bag strap and gave a patient nod. "This is my house," Colleen scoffed, her laugh sharp and humorless. "That's funny." She pointed at the modern white stone mansion behind him. "You mean to tell me this is yours?" Shaq's jaw tightened. He didn't miss the way she emphasized this, like the idea of someone like him owning a house in her community was a joke. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Colleen's eyes narrowed behind her oversized sunglasses. "That's impossible. I know everyone in this community, and I've never seen you before. So why don't you tell me who you're really visiting?" Shaq let out a slow breath. He could already see where this was going. He had 2 options: ignore her and walk inside, or entertain whatever nonsense she was about to pull. Against his better judgment, he decided to see how far she'd take it. "You know everyone here?" he asked, raising a brow. "You sure about that?" Colleen lifted her chin. "I'm on the HOA board. I make it my business to know." Shaq smirked. "Then you ain't been doing your job right." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't appreciate your tone. I don't appreciate being questioned outside my own house." For a split second, something flickered across Colleen's face. Uncertainty, maybe even embarrassment. But she wasn't the type to back down. Instead, she pulled her phone out of her purse. "Well, we're going to settle this right now," she said, dialing quickly. "Security will clear this up in 2 minutes." Shaq sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Of course. Colleen put the phone to her ear, stepping a few feet away as she waited for an answer. Shaq could hear her speaking, her voice just loud enough for him to catch the words, suspicious person and possible trespasser. He shook his head, chuckling to himself. This woman really thought she was about to get him removed from his own driveway. Across the street, a few more neighbors had stepped outside, pretending to water plants or check their mail while obviously eavesdropping. Shaq felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't new. He had dealt with racism in various forms, subtle, loud, corporate, casual. But something about being questioned outside his own home hit differently. His patience was wearing thin. Colleen hung up and turned back to him, looking far too pleased with herself. Security's on their way, she announced. I suggest you wait right there. Shaq folded his arms, expression unreadable. Yeah, he said. I ain't going anywhere. She raised a brow. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Shaq let out a deep chuckle. Lady, I ain't even started. Colleen's smug expression faltered just a little. The waiting game had begun, and Shaq had all the time in the world. The minutes stretched on, thick with tension. Shaq leaned against his SUV, completely unbothered, while Colleen checked her phone repeatedly, her confidence slowly shifting to impatience. Then in the distance, the sound of sirens. Shaq looked up, squinting toward the neighborhood's front gate. Colleen smirked. Oh, good. They're here. Shaq's expression didn't change, but something sharp and unshakable settled in his chest. So this wasn't just security. She called the cops. Shaq pushed off the car, rolling his shoulders. All right then. If she wanted a scene, she was about to get one. And this time, the whole world would be watching. Colleen's fingers moved swiftly, her manicured nails tapping against the glass screen of her iPhone as she pressed 911 without a second thought. Her voice, already laced with feigned distress, turned sharp as soon as the dispatcher picked up. Yes, I need to report a trespasser in my neighborhood. He's standing in a driveway acting suspicious. He won't leave. Shaq let out a slow breath, crossing his arms over his broad chest as he watched her pace a few feet away, phone pressed tightly to her ear. He could hear every word, the way she carefully crafted her lie, the way she deliberately omitted key details, like the fact that the house behind him was his own. He didn't interrupt. He had seen this story before. Different day, different place, same setup. Can you describe the individual? The dispatcher asked. Colleen's eyes flickered toward Shaq, her lips pressing into a thin line before she turned away, pretending to look shaken. He's huge, at least 7 feet, very muscular, and black. He's just standing there, watching me. I don't know what he's planning, but I feel unsafe. The words hung in the air, heavy with intention. Shaq exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. She wasn't scared. She wanted to make sure the police were. The dispatcher's tone subtly shifted, the calm professionalism giving way to urgency. All right, ma'am, stay on the line. Are you in immediate danger? Colleen glanced over her shoulder, voice dropping into a forced whisper. I don't know. He hasn't moved, but he's just standing there, like he's waiting for something. I think he might be on something. Please hurry. Shaq's fingers curled into fists before he forced himself to relax. She was crafting a narrative, a big, dangerous black man, standing still, doing nothing, yet somehow a threat. And just like that, the dispatcher confirmed it. Officers are on their way. Colleen let out a fake relieved sigh, turning back toward Shaq, her expression smug. Well, I hope you're happy. They'll be here any minute. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply studied her, his eyes cold, unreadable. You do this a lot? He asked finally, his voice even. Colleen bristled. Excuse me? Shaq tilted his head slightly. You call the cops when you see black folks in the neighborhood. That a habit of yours? Her mouth opened, then snapped shut as if trying to find the right lie. Shaq scoffed, shaking his head. Yeah, thought so. Just then, the deep rumble of an engine cut through the tension. A sleek, midnight blue Porsche Taycan pulled into the driveway, rolling to a smooth stop behind Shaq's Rolls-Royce. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Mason Brooks. Tall, sharply dressed, and radiating the kind of confidence that only came with money and power, Mason was Shaq's best friend, longtime business partner, and one of the most respected entertainment lawyers in the country. And in that moment, he took one look at the situation and instantly knew what was happening. Mason shut his car door, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blazer as he strolled over, his eyes flickering between Shaq and Colleen. "What's going on here?" he asked, though he already had a damn good guess. Shaq exhaled, nodding toward Colleen. "She says I don't live here." Mason's brows lifted slightly. Then he turned his attention to the woman. "That right?" Colleen squared her shoulders, regaining some of her arrogance. "I don't know who you are, but I don't have to explain myself. This is a private community, and I have every right to report suspicious activity." Mason let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Suspicious? You mean a black man standing in his own driveway? Damn, lady, you ain't even creative with it." Colleen's cheeks flushed. "I don't appreciate your tone." Mason smirked. "I don't appreciate racists wasting police resources. But here we are." Colleen's grip tightened around her phone, but before she could fire back, Mason turned to Shaq. "Cops on the way?" Shaq nodded. Mason rolled his eyes. "You want me to call Langford? Get ahead of this?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, let's see how they handle it." Mason studied him for a beat, then smirked. "Bet." He stepped back, leaning casually against the Porsche, looking as unbothered as Shaq. Colleen glanced between them, something flickering behind her expression. Uncertainty. They weren't reacting the way she expected. She wanted fear, obedience, compliance. Instead, they were waiting, like they'd seen this play out before, like they weren't worried, like they knew something she didn't. A tense silence settled over the driveway, thick and suffocating. Shaq glanced at his watch. Any minute now. Colleen shifted her weight from foot to foot, gripping her phone like a lifeline. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood watching. Some neighbors had stepped onto their porches, pretending to be occupied with meaningless tasks, while eavesdropping on every second of the exchange. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her features. Had she miscalculated? Maybe this wasn't going to go the way she thought. Mason noticed the hesitation in her expression and smirked. "Something wrong?" Colleen stiffened. This shouldn't be taking this long." Shaq chuckled. "You nervous?" Her eyes snapped to his. "Why would I be nervous?" Shaq shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." And then, the sirens came. Loud, fast, aggressive. 3 black and white squad cars rolled up to the entrance of the estate, red and blue lights flashing wildly against the sunlight. Shaq let out a slow breath. "Here we go." Colleen smiled triumphantly. Mason just laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, she thinks she won. That's cute." Shaq rolled his shoulders, exhaling one last time before the real storm hit. The patrol cars came to a screeching stop, doors flying open as officers piled out quickly, hands hovering near their belts. Colleen turned on the performance instantly. Her posture shifted, her breath suddenly labored, her hand clutching her chest like she had survived some traumatic ordeal. She took a deliberate step toward the officers, her voice wavering just enough to sound convincing. "Thank God you're here. I was so scared. He just wouldn't leave." Shaq clenched his jaw. "Here we go." The officer's eyes snapped to him, and just like that, he wasn't a homeowner anymore. He was a suspect. Shaq met Mason's gaze. Mason sighed, pushing off the car. "You want me to handle this, or you got it?" Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "Nah," he said, stepping forward. "I got it." The sirens tore through the quiet streets of West Haven Estates, their high-pitched wails bouncing off the pristine mansions and neatly trimmed hedges. Within seconds, 3 black and white patrol cars screeched to a stop just outside Shaq's driveway. Their doors swung open in unison, and uniformed officers poured out, moving fast, moving aggressively. Shaq watched, expression unreadable, posture relaxed. He had been in this situation before. He knew better than to flinch. The first officer, Sergeant Royland, was tall and built like a linebacker. his buzz cut barely visible beneath his patrol cap. His sharp, narrowed eyes swept across the scene, already forming a conclusion before a single question was asked. His hand rested near his holster as he scanned the driveway. Expensive cars, a massive black man standing too comfortably, a distressed white woman. It was enough for him to assume something was wrong. Before Shaq could say a word, a blur of movement caught his eye. Colleen rushed forward, breath ragged, eyes wide with exaggerated panic. "Officers! Oh, thank God you're here!" Her voice trembled, her carefully crafted distress rolling off her tongue like a script rehearsed 1,000 times. She clutched her chest, gasping as if she had just survived a near-death experience. He won't leave. He's been standing here watching me. I feel so unsafe." Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. "Here we go." Sergeant Royland's gaze snapped to Shaq, hard and suspicious. He didn't ask any questions, didn't verify anything. He just moved with authority. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Shaq let out a slow breath. "You want to try that again?" With a little less "I already made up my mind" in your tone, the officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step away from the vehicle." Shaq didn't move. "This is my home, officer." His voice was steady, controlled. "Check your records. I've lived here for 6 years." Royland wasn't listening. He took a deliberate step forward, and the 2 other officers mirrored his movements, closing in. Shaq knew this playbook. Surround the suspect, establish dominance, make them comply. He wouldn't fall for it. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again, and I'm not going to repeat myself." Shaq cut in, tone calm but firm. "You want proof? Run my plates, check my name. Hell, call the HOA. I'll wait." A flicker of hesitation crossed Royland's face. A moment of doubt. And that's when Mason stepped in. "Hey, officer, quick question." Royland turned just as Mason Brooks stepped forward, hands in his pockets, expression deceptively casual. "You ever get tired of this?" Mason asked, tilting his head slightly. "Rolling up to a rich neighborhood just to realize you're about to embarrass yourself, or is that part of the thrill?" Royland's face darkened. "Who the hell are you?" Mason smirked. "Mason Brooks, entertainment lawyer, and currently the guy reminding you that you're about to go viral for all the wrong reasons." Royland's eyes flicked toward Shaq again, hesitating. He recognized the name now, maybe even recognized the face. Mason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "If I were you, I'd call dispatch and confirm the address before you and your boys become the next meme." Silence. Royland exhaled sharply, jaw tightening as he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, confirm the registered owner of 714 West Haven Drive." A brief pause. Then, "Copy that. Owner is Big Shaq." And just like that, everything changed. Royland's face flushed red. Colleen stiffened. The 2 other officers exchanged uneasy glances. Mason chuckled under his breath. "Damn, that's tough." Shaq simply lifted a brow. "So, we good now?" Royland cleared his throat, stepping back slightly as if distance could erase the mistake. "Apologies for the confusion, Mr. O'Neill. We were responding to a report of suspicious activity." Mason let out a loud, sarcastic laugh. "Suspicious activity? You mean a man standing in his own driveway? That's what we're calling suspicious these days?" Royland's gaze flickered toward Colleen, who was suddenly very quiet. Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame making the officers visibly uncomfortable. "Let me ask you something, officer," he said, voice still dangerously calm. "If I were white, would we be having this conversation?" Royland's face twitched. He said nothing, because they all knew the answer. Before anyone else could speak, a door creaked open across the street. All eyes turned as Lucas Monroe, a quiet but well-respected neighbor, stepped onto his porch. He was older, maybe in his 60s, a retired professor, always the observer. And right now, he was watching intently. Colleen shifted uncomfortably. "Lucas, this isn't your business." Lucas took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes never leaving her. "Oh, I think it is." The tension thickened. Lucas took another step forward, voice steady but filled with weight. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 22 years. And I've seen this happen before. Royland turned to him. Sir, do you have something to add? Lucas nodded. Yeah, I do. He looked directly at Colleen. She's done this before. Silence. Colleen's face went pale. Shaq tilted his head slightly, intrigued. Oh? That so? Lucas nodded, his voice never wavering. 2 years ago, a black teenager was walking his dog near the park. She called security, said he was acting suspicious. He glanced at Colleen. Turned out he was her neighbor's nephew. Royland turned back toward Colleen, expression unreadable. Lucas continued. Then last summer, a Latino landscaper was trimming hedges outside her property. She claimed he was lurking and had security remove him. Colleen took a step back. That's not true. Lucas raised a brow. Isn't it? She clamped her mouth shut, because everyone knew. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. Damn, that's a pattern, huh? Mason smirked. Real consistent behavior. She should get an award. Colleen's hands shook as she turned toward Royland, desperation creeping into her voice. You're not seriously believing this, are you? I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Ma'am. Royland's voice was flat, drained. He had nothing left to defend. We'll need you to come down to the station for questioning. Colleen froze. What? But I called you. Shaq let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Damn. Hate when that backfires, huh? She stared at him, face twisted in disbelief. Because this wasn't how the story was supposed to go, but for once it wasn't hers to control. And this time, she was the one being removed. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Shaq had been here before. Not in this exact driveway, not with these exact cops, but in situations just like this, where his wealth, his fame, his achievements meant nothing. Where he wasn't a legend. Where he was just a black man being told to prove he belonged. And he was done playing that game. Sergeant Royland adjusted his belt, stepping forward with a firm, authoritative stance. Sir, we need to see some ID. Shaq didn't move. His voice was calm but edged with steel. I don't have to prove I belong in my own home. The officers exchanged glances, a flicker of hesitation. This wasn't how it usually went. They were used to people complying. They were used to fear. Shaq? He wasn't scared. He was bored. Colleen, standing off to the side, scoffed loudly. Oh, please. If you have nothing to hide, just show them your ID. Shaq's eyes flicked toward her, his gaze sharp. Lady, you called the cops on me. You lied. You painted me as a threat. And now you want me to prove I exist? Nah. You prove I don't. Colleen's face twitched. I just... Mason let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Wow. This is embarrassing. Royland shot him a sharp look. You got something to say? Mason smirked. Yeah, I do. You got a database, right? Run his name. Or better yet, Google him. Royland's expression hardened. We follow procedure. Mason let out an exaggerated sigh. Yeah, I'm sure. That's why you showed up to a trespassing call and didn't even ask the guy standing in the driveway his side of the story first. One of the younger officers, a redhead with a telltale rookie stance, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat. Sergeant, maybe we should... Royland cut him off with a sharp glare. But the doubt was spreading. Colleen, sensing the shift, desperately tried to reclaim control. She turned toward Shaq, her voice dripping with manufactured frustration. Fine. If you really live here, then tell them the house number. Shaq raised a brow. What number's on the driveway? Colleen blinked. Go on, Shaq continued, folding his arms. If you know this neighborhood so well, you should know the house number you're accusing me of trespassing at. Silence. Colleen's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find an answer. She didn't know. The officers were watching now, eyes narrowing. Mason smirked. Damn. You don't even know what driveway you're standing in? That's rough. Colleen's face flushed bright red. I must have mixed up the numbers, but that doesn't change anything. I felt unsafe. That's all that matters. Shaq let out a slow, humorless chuckle. Unsafe. While I stood here, doing nothing, right. Royland's jaw tightened. The cracks were showing. And then, the final nail in the coffin arrived. A white golf cart rolled up the street, the golden badge of the West Haven Estate security team glinting in the sun. Behind the wheel sat Dean Porter, 50s, salt and pepper hair, a former Marine turned head of security for one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Miami. And the moment his eyes landed on Shaq, his entire demeanor changed. "Mr. O'Neill!" He let out a booming laugh, throwing the golf cart in park. "Didn't know you were back from LA. How was the trip?" Royland's entire body stiffened. Colleen paled. "Shaq?" He just grinned. "Not bad, Dean. Just got home. Or, well, trying to." Dean's brows pulled together. He looked at the cops, then at Colleen, then back at Shaq. He immediately put the pieces together. His expression darkened. "What the hell is going on here?" Royland cleared his throat. "We were responding to a call about a possible trespasser." Dean snorted. "A trespasser? You mean the guy who's donated thousands to the HOA? The one who gave y'all free game tickets last Christmas? That trespasser?" The younger officer, the rookie, bit his lip, clearly realizing just how bad this looked. Dean shook his head, angry now. He turned to Colleen. "You called 911 on Shaq? On your own damn neighbor?" Colleen's hands shook. I didn't know. He looked suspicious." Dean stared at her like she had grown another head. "Suspicious? You serious right now? The man is 7 feet tall. He's literally the most recognizable person in this entire damn neighborhood." Mason chuckled under his breath. "That's what I said." Royland exhaled through his nose, shoulders visibly tense. "All right, we're clearing the call. There's no issue here." Mason smirked. "Oh, there's an issue. Just not the one you thought." Royland ignored him. Dean turned back to Shaq, his voice lower now. "You good, man? You want me to file an incident report?" Shaq rubbed his jaw, glancing at Colleen, who was still standing there, her world crumbling around her. For a long beat, he didn't say anything. Then finally, "Nah, let her sit with it." Dean nodded, but his sharp glare at Colleen made one thing clear. She wasn't walking away from this unscathed. And Shaq? He was done entertaining the stupidity. Without another word, he turned, casually strolling toward his front door, Mason falling into step beside him. The officers stood awkwardly in the driveway, unsure of what to do now that they had been proven wrong. Colleen looked lost. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. And she knew it. As Shaq reached the front steps, Mason nudged him with his elbow. "So, we just gonna pretend that wasn't the funniest shot we've ever seen?" Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, that was embarrassing. For them." Mason grinned. "Think they'll apologize?" Shaq shot him a dry look. Mason laughed. "Yeah, didn't think so." Shaq stepped inside, exhaling deeply. A normal day turned into another reminder. Fame didn't change everything. Money didn't buy acceptance. But power? Power meant walking away with your head high while they stood there looking like fools. And in the end, that was the real victory. 5. The neighborhood takes sides. Who stands for justice? 1,500 words. The silence that followed was heavier than the Miami heat. Shaq stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as the reality of the moment settled into the air like thick smoke. The cops had left. The accusations had crumbled. The entire mess was over. Or at least it should have been. But even with the flashing lights gone and the sirens fading into the distance, the real storm was just beginning. Because now the neighborhood had to pick a side. Across the street, a few neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, their faces unreadable. Some were pretending to check their mail, water their plants, do anything except acknowledge what just happened. Because if they acknowledged it, they had to have an opinion. And opinions? They made people uncomfortable. A few whispered conversations broke out, hushed murmurs between husbands and wives, between friends who suddenly weren't sure where they stood. They had all seen it. Colleen had lied. The police had assumed the worst. Shaq had been forced to prove himself in his own home. And yet, the air was thick with hesitation. Because speaking up? That required courage. And courage wasn't something West Haven Estates was known for. Then, finally, Someone broke the silence. This isn't the first time she's done something like this. All eyes turned toward Lucas Monroe, the quietest man in the neighborhood, the one who never spoke much, never attended HOA meetings, never got involved in drama. But right now, he wasn't staying quiet. Lucas took a slow sip of his coffee, gaze fixed on Colleen, his tone steady. She's done this before. Colleen's head snapped toward him, her face flushing pale. Excuse me? Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. 2 years ago. There was a black teenager walking his dog. She called security, said he looked out of place. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "I remember that." Lucas continued, unbothered. Last summer, she told a moving truck to leave because she didn't believe the new homeowners actually lived here. More whispers, more shifting, more realization. Colleen's face twisted in disbelief. "That's not true. I was just—" Lucas cut her off. "You were just being cautious, right?" Colleen opened her mouth, then froze, because suddenly, everyone was looking at her differently. Not with sympathy, not with agreement, but with something much worse. Recognition, like they had always known who she was, but now they had to admit it. Shaq let out a slow breath. He had expected the police situation, expected Colleen's reaction. But the part that stung the most, the part that made his chest feel tight with something deeper than frustration, the fact that he had lived here for 6 years. And yet, this moment proved he had never really been accepted. Not truly, not fully. Because if he had been seen as a real part of this neighborhood, as family, as a friend, then why had no one stopped her? Why had they waited for the police to decide his fate? Why had they stood there watching until it was safe to pick a side? Colleen let out a sharp laugh, though it sounded forced, desperate. "Oh, so now I'm the villain. I was just doing what any responsible neighbor would do. It's not my fault I didn't recognize him." Shaq's jaw clenched. "You didn't recognize me?" Colleen turned back to him, arms crossed. "That's right. I had no idea who you were." Mason stepped forward, shaking his head. "That's a lie." Colleen scoffed. "Excuse me?" Mason's voice was flat, sharp, cutting. "You knew exactly who he was." She blinked. "What? You just didn't think a black man could own a house like this." Silence. Pure. Deafening. Silence. Colleen's lips parted as if to argue, but nothing came out, because there was nothing to say, nothing she could say. Mason folded his arms. "Say it, Colleen. Say that's not what you thought. Say that's not why you called the cops." Colleen's hands shook. I just... Say it." She didn't. She couldn't. Because if she did, then she would have to admit the truth. And the truth? It would ruin her. A new voice cut through the tension. She wanted him gone. And she didn't care how. Everyone turned to see Margot Stevenson, another longtime resident, stepping forward, her lips pressed into a firm line. Margot had always been neutral, one of those people who just wanted things to stay quiet, stay smooth, stay normal. But today she had seen too much, and she wasn't staying neutral anymore. She looked at Colleen, something in her gaze hard, unwavering. "You didn't feel unsafe. You felt uncomfortable. There's a difference." Colleen let out a strangled breath, turning to the others for support. But it wasn't there. The neighbors who had once been her allies, her friends, her community, they weren't looking at her the same way anymore. Because now they saw her for what she really was. Shaq inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The apology he had been waiting for, hoping for. It wasn't coming. Because people like Colleen, they never apologized. Not really. Instead, they doubled down. Instead, they ran. And sure enough, Colleen let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "I don't have to listen to this." And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, slamming the door behind her. Shaq watched her go, exhaling through his nose. Mason nudged him. "Think that's the last we'll hear from her?" Shaq scoffed. "Nah. Women like her? They don't go quiet." Mason smirked. Yeah, you're probably right. But it didn't matter. Because today, she lost. And everyone knew it. The crowd slowly dispersed. Some neighbors shuffled back inside, avoiding eye contact. Others came up, offering quiet words of support, of regret, of understanding. It was too little, too late. But maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something different. Maybe the next time they wouldn't wait. Maybe the next time they wouldn't hesitate. Maybe the next time they'd get it right. Shaq watched them go, his mind already on the next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Miami sun had barely set before the real storm hit. The sirens were gone. The officers had left. Colleen was holed up in her house, blinds shut tight, dodging phone calls. But the story? It was just getting started. Because while everyone was caught up in the chaos, one person had been watching, recording, waiting. And now, the world was about to see everything. Lucas Monroe sat on his porch, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the upload button. He had captured it all. Every word, every lie, every moment of humiliation as Colleen's story fell apart. He took a deep breath, knowing that once he posted this, there was no taking it back. Then, without hesitation, he pressed upload. It started small. A few shares, a few comments. Then, like wildfire, it spread. Within an hour, the video had 50,000 views. By midnight, 2 million. The captions were brutal. Karen calls cops on Shaq in his own driveway. Even a legend isn't safe from racism. She thought she could get away with it until security showed up. People couldn't believe what they were watching. Big Shaq, a global icon, a household name, a millionaire living in his own home, was treated like a criminal just for existing. And Colleen? She had just become the most hated woman on the internet. By the next morning, reporters were camped outside the gates of West Haven Estates. Camera crews, microphones, flashing lights, Colleen's worst nightmare. The headlines were everywhere. CNN. Big Shaq confronted by police at his own home after racially charged 911 call. NBC. Viral video shows disturbing pattern of racial profiling in America's wealthiest neighborhoods. Fox News. Overreaction or justified. Heated debate over Shaq's viral incident. Everyone had an opinion. Some reporters framed it as a cautionary tale about racial bias. Others tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. But no matter how they twisted it, the fact remained. The whole world saw what happened, and now there was no running from it. It didn't take long for internet detectives to do what they do best. Dig. And what they found? It was ugly. Screenshots of HOA complaints she had filed against Black and Latino residents. Emails where she referred to certain neighbors as undesirables. A Facebook post from 2 years ago where she ranted about how the neighborhood was changing too much. The receipts were endless, and suddenly people realized this wasn't a one-time thing, this was a pattern. Colleen had spent years policing who she thought belonged in her neighborhood. Now, she was the one being policed. Back inside his home, Shaq sat on his couch, phone buzzing nonstop. Text messages, calls, emails. Everyone wanted to know one thing. Would he press charges? Mason paced across the room, shaking his head. Bro, you have every right to. False police report? Harassment? You could bury her. Shaq leaned back, exhaling. I know. Mason frowned. Then why are you hesitating? Shaq rubbed a hand over his face. Because he knew how this played out. If he pressed charges, it would become a drawn-out legal battle. Lawyers, court dates, more headlines. And Colleen? She'd twist it, make herself the victim. She'd go on some news show, crying about how her life was ruined, how she had made an innocent mistake, and people would believe it. Not all, but enough. And Shaq was tired. He just wanted to live his life. Mason sighed, sitting down across from him. So what are you going to do? Shaq's gaze hardened. He didn't know yet, but one thing was clear. Colleen thought she could erase him from his own space. Now? He was about to do something she'd never forget. Shaq wasn't a man who played by other people's rules. He had spent his life proving people wrong. On the court, in business, in every room where they underestimated him. But this was different. Because this wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about money. This was about power. And Shaq was about to make a move that no one, especially Colleen, would ever see coming. Mason was still talking, still listing all the legal ways they could take Colleen down. But Shaq wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the HOA property records displayed on his phone screen. Because while Colleen had spent the last 24 hours hiding from the media, deleting social media, dodging interview requests, Shaq had been researching. And what he found, it was almost too perfect. Mason finally noticed the look on his face. What? What's that look? Shaq smirked, tilting his phone toward him. I'm buying her house. Mason blinked, then blinked again. Wait, what? Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. She wanted me out of this neighborhood so bad. Fine. Let's make sure she's the one who leaves. Mason stared at him for a long second. Then slowly, a grin stretched across his face. Oh, that's cold. I love it. Shaq chuckled. It's not about revenge. It's about setting the record straight. She doesn't own this place. She never did. Mason shook his head, laughing under his breath. Man, I can't wait to see her face. Neither could Shaq. The news spread fast, faster than the viral video, faster than the scandal. Within hours, the HOA board had been informed. Real estate agents were scrambling, and the neighborhood, they were divided. Some people loved it. This is the most legendary thing I've ever seen. That's how you handle a racist, by her entire existence. Big Shaq just made the ultimate power move. She wanted him gone. Now she's the one packing. Others, though, not so much. Was this really necessary? Hasn't she suffered enough? She made a mistake, but ruining her life seems excessive. I just don't think this helps race relations. It's only making things worse. Shaq wasn't surprised. People like Colleen had been getting away with this nonsense for decades. And now that there were real consequences, suddenly they wanted mercy. Shaq didn't play that game. The moment Colleen got wind of the sale, she lost it. She stormed into the HOA offices, demanding answers. But the problem? She didn't have any options. Her name wasn't on the deed. The house legally belonged to her ex-husband, who had been trying to sell it for months. And Shaq? He made an offer too good to refuse. Colleen tried to block the sale, filed complaints, called her few remaining allies in the HOA. But one by one, they backed away. She wasn't useful to them anymore. She wasn't powerful anymore. And without that, she was nothing. The moment the papers were signed, Colleen officially lost everything. Her friends? Gone. The HOA board? They stopped taking her calls. The realtors? They pretended she didn't exist. No one wanted to be associated with her. Because now she wasn't the victim. She was the punchline. Her name was cemented in internet history as the woman who tried to erase Shaq from his own driveway and got erased from the neighborhood instead. And Shaq? He hadn't lifted a finger. She did it to herself. When the news broke, reporters rushed for a statement. They wanted a headline. They wanted a scandal. But when Shaq finally spoke, his words caught everyone off guard. This was never about revenge. The cameras clicked. The microphones moved closer. Shaq's expression was calm, steady. I don't need revenge. I need change. Silence. Then he continued. Colleen tried to erase me. She thought she had power over me, over who belongs here. But she never did. That's the real lesson. A pause. Then, we can't keep letting this happen, not just to me, but to anyone. Because if I wasn't Big Shaq, if I didn't have cameras, lawyers, a name people recognize, how does this story end? The room was dead silent, because everyone knew the answer. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. This isn't just about me. It's about what happens next. And I plan to make sure this conversation doesn't just end here. Then, without another word, he walked away. Because his point, it had already been made. The air in West Haven Estates felt different. Not because the houses had changed. Not because the streets weren't still lined with luxury cars, towering palm trees, and neatly trimmed hedges. But because something beneath the surface had shifted. And no one could pretend otherwise. Shaq sat on the back patio of his home, a glass of lemonade resting beside him, the Miami sunset stretching across the sky in warm hues of orange and purple. He had spent years building a life of success, respect, and influence. And still, none of it had been enough. He had been treated like a trespasser in his own driveway. Not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. If the cameras hadn't been rolling, if Mason hadn't shown up, if security hadn't arrived at the right moment, Shaq knew exactly how differently things could have played out. And that thought, it stuck with him. Because for every high-profile case like his, there were hundreds of others. People who didn't have the resources, the fame, the legal connections to protect themselves. People who were erased without a trace. That was the part he couldn't shake. Because if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. In the days following the incident, something surprising happened. Neighbors, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had hesitated, the ones who had looked away, began to speak up. Some came to Shaq's door in person. Some sent emails. Some just left handwritten notes, slipped into his mailbox late at night. But the messages were all the same. Apologies, admissions, regret. I should have said something sooner. I realize now that I ignored things because they didn't affect me. I want to do better. I will do better. It wasn't instant redemption. It wasn't a magical fix. But it was a start. And for the first time since the whole mess began, Shaq wondered, maybe this had happened for a reason. Maybe this wasn't just about one racist woman's downfall. Maybe this was about something bigger. Colleen was gone. No official farewell. No last desperate attempt to clear her name. Just vanished. Her house, now legally Shaq's, sat empty for a few weeks, waiting for its next purpose. The few remaining friends she had in the neighborhood stopped talking about her. Some deleted old pictures with her from their social media, quietly erasing any connection to her. It was like she had never existed. Shaq didn't waste time thinking about where she went. Wherever she was, one thing was certain. She wasn't coming back. Shaq wasn't just going to buy Colleen's house and let it sit there as a trophy. He had bigger plans. Within weeks, the renovations began. The once cold, pristine mansion was transformed into something it had never been. Welcoming, warm, full of life. Where Colleen had once shut people out, Shaq was bringing people in. He turned the space into a mentorship center, a place for young Black and Latino kids from underprivileged backgrounds to get career advice, financial literacy training, and access to resources they wouldn't normally have. It became a safe haven, a place for growth, a place for belonging. And when the grand opening was announced, the headline said it all. The house that tried to exclude now opens its doors to all. Shaq wasn't just changing the neighborhood, he was changing the narrative. As the months passed, the media coverage died down. The neighborhood settled into its new reality. But Shaq knew. This wasn't just about one woman's prejudice. It wasn't just about Colleen. It was about the system that allowed her to feel so entitled in the first place. The system that made her believe she could erase a man from his own home. This was bigger than one incident, bigger than one viral moment. This was about generations of bias. And if there was one thing Shaq was sure of, this fight wasn't over. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. Shaq had always known that money and fame didn't erase racism. But now he understood something deeper. Racism doesn't disappear overnight. It doesn't vanish just because one person gets exposed. One injustice gets called out. One conversation gets louder. It lingers. It adapts. It waits for people to forget. But Shaq, he wasn't forgetting. And neither was this neighborhood, because everything had changed, and this time there was no going back. Months passed. The chaos settled. Reporters moved on. Social media found new scandals. The world kept spinning. And Shaq? Shaq kept living. His days went back to business meetings, charity events, spending time with his family, playing ball with kids at the local rec center. But something inside him had shifted. Every time he walked out his front door, every time he pulled into his driveway, every time he saw his house, the house he had fought to stand in, he was reminded, Not just of what had happened, but of what it meant. Because no matter how much he had built, no matter how much he had given back, that woman still tried to erase him. And for a brief moment, the entire neighborhood had let it happen. That wasn't something he could ignore. West Haven Estates was still a place of luxury, of status, of wealth. But something about it felt different now. People weren't so quick to look away anymore. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening out in the open. A group of neighbors started a community initiative, pushing for more inclusivity in local hiring and housing policies. A couple of younger residents organized a series of discussions on racial bias. The same people who had once stayed silent when Shaq was accused of trespassing were now speaking up in moments that mattered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't some instant utopia, but it was a start. And Shaq, he was watching. Because change didn't just happen because people got caught. Real change happened when people chose to be better. It was a warm evening. The kind where the sky was streaked in gold and purple, where the air was thick but peaceful. Shaq sat in a comfortable chair on his driveway, his legs stretched out, a cold drink in his hand. The same driveway where a rich white woman once told him he didn't belong. Now, that same driveway was full of life. Across the street, kids dribbled a basketball on a newly built court, laughing, shouting, running barefoot across the pavement. The court was part of the mentorship center now housed in Colleen's old place. A place that had once been about exclusion was now about inclusion. Shaq watched them play, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Mason walked up beside him, hands in his pockets. Not a bad view. Shaq took a sip of his drink, nodding. Not bad at all. Mason let out a chuckle. Man, you know what's funny? She really thought she could erase you from this place. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. And then, finally, he spoke the words that had been sitting in his chest for months. They tried to erase me from my own home. Now my presence is something they'll never forget. And as he sat there, relaxed, unbothered, at peace, he knew the truth. He had already won. Racism doesn't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides behind fear, privilege, and concern. Shaq had the platform to fight back. But what about those who don't? How many people get erased, ignored, or silenced just because no one is watching? Share this story. Start the conversation. Speak up when it matters. Because change doesn't happen when we wait for the next viral moment. It happens when we refuse to look away.